For me, it was just a personal conscience thing because of what I went through in the 70s and the 80s with my sport, and how let down I felt by the IOC, and how many of my friends would have had a very different life if they'd won the medals they should have won. In sports like rugby and boxing, we were genuinely waiting for someone to be, a woman to be paralysed or killed by this unbelievably irresponsible move to pretend that males didn't have a benefit. Women literally were just told, you have to accept being treated as second-class citizens.
Hello, I'm Georgina Mumford, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Olympic swimmer and women's rights campaigner Sharron Davies. Sharron, welcome.
Hello, nice to be here. Do you know what's lovely about that? Is you introduced me as Olympic swimmer. I get introduced as former this and former that all the time. And once you're an Olympian, you're always an Olympian.
Always, yeah.
I'm always going to be an Olympic medalist.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
We're talking a week after the International Olympic Committee has signalled this change of heart on including biological males in women's sports. Is this a moment of vindication, Sharron, for women's rights campaigners such as yourself?
Well, it's a very big step in the right direction. It's not official at the moment. This is just kind of leaked information, but it's good information. We've now got Kirsty Coventry, who is an ex-Olympic swimmer, and the head doctor, who's an ex-Olympic rower, female, that have taken over from what I would say was an absolute shambles last year in Paris, and a very misogynistic attitude to, women being in serious danger in a boxing ring. And I think it's partly that, but it's also very much that LA will be the next Olympic Games, which is in America. And as we know, Donald Trump has said that he will protect the female category. So I think the IOC have been pushed into this position. I'm not sure that they've, done it as willingly as we would love them to do it. But if the end result is that they protect female athletes to have a female-only category, then I will be very pleased.
And you mentioned there that this was kind of a forced decision rather than the IOC taking a moral stand or anything. Do you think that that's in response to women's rights campaigners or even just a general sort of vibe shift on the topic of transgenderism in sports?
Yeah, I think the general public has never been on side with allowing males to be in sport for females, because any sane person knows that's the whole reason why we have separate categories. People know that males have a biological, physiological benefit when it comes to sport. The range at Olympic level is anywhere between 10 and 30%. So weightlifting being, the higher end at 30%, sort of middle distance running being around 10%. But things like boxing, a male will punch 160% harder than a female of equal weight onto a less dense bone structure. So in sports like rugby and boxing, we were genuinely waiting for someone to be, a woman to be paralysed or killed by this unbelievably irresponsible move to pretend that males didn't have a benefit because they're born males. And it just breaks my heart that, yet again, the IOC just removed those rights of women 10 years ago with any consultation with elite female athletes. In 1998, the IOC polled its female elite athletes and asking them, do you want sex screening to carry on? 82% said, yes, we want you to carry on. And they just ignored it. So what actually was the point of asking their female athletes? If 82% can't persuade you that that's what they want you to do to carry on protecting the female category. So the IOC have a terrible history with regards to looking after women's sport. My own history is of the East German era. It's probably the biggest reason I speak out. I saw what those terrible drugs did to those young girls. Many of them have died since. And obviously a whole generation lost out on the medals that they should have actually won because the IOC did nothing for over 20 years. And they didn't stop it even then. It was stopped because the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and therefore what was the old East Germany no longer existed. They let two generations, two groups of women down and a couple of generations, and hundreds of young women would have had a very different life if they'd won the medals they should have won.
Absolutely. Can you speak a bit more about those parallels that you've experienced sort of between that era of state-sponsored doping and now women being forced to compete against biological men?
Yes, so mid-70s, really early 70s, the East Germans decided that they could get a very big benefit in women's sport if they fed them male testosterone, steranabol, and they started giving these young girls these drugs from the age 11. Initially, they were telling them that, these little blue pills were vitamins. the girls were reasonably unaware, but at some point they would have been aware that they were having a male puberty. They weren't having a female puberty. They were always kept very separate. They were never allowed to mix with us. I remember my first European Championships in 77. I was only 14 years old. We put an official complaint in because we thought there was builders in the change rooms and the girls' change rooms. And it turned out that it is the East German women's swimming team. So obviously it changes your voice, it changes your chin, you start to grow hair, you develop, male characteristics. And it was extremely obvious. And they had this huge success in women's sport and very little success in the men's sport. And in my Olympic Games, they won 6 1-2-3s on the podiums and practically no medals in the men's events whatsoever. So everybody on the side of the pool, on the side of the track, watching rowing, which was the 3 sports they really concentrated on, absolutely knew what was going on. And the IOC even had East German athletes who defected, who managed to get out of East Germany and took their little blue pills to listen and said, look, this is what we're being given. And still they carried on ignoring it. So, they genuinely have blood on their hands because many of these East German girls have died because the drugs were so awful. An awful lot of them have had disabled children. All of them have health issues. And when the wall came down, there were a lot of court cases. So, these athletes went to court and they said they were given these drugs and this is what it's done. And they did do a payout. It was a very small payout, but they gave them a payout. So all of this is in the public domain. And yet still the IOC had not corrected that area in sport. If you go back and look at who was the Olympic champion in 1980, it will still say Petra Schneider, who has gone to court. And we have all the paperwork to show what drugs they were given. It's ridiculous that they have learned no lessons. And then, as I say, in 2015, they allowed trans-identifying males to identify into women's sport with all sorts of ridiculous rules about reducing testosterone, none of them based on any proved science whatsoever. It's obvious if someone has gone through puberty that they're going to have an advantage. But even not going through male puberty, males have a different biology. They have a different bone structure for starters. They have a thing called the Q angle, which is your hips to your knees. And for women, we're about 50% more, which means that males automatically get better cadence and better dynamic energy out of the lower part of their body. In football, women get 6 times as many ACL knee injuries, because of these reasons. And none of those things are removed by suppressing testosterone whatsoever. And once you've boiled an egg, gone through puberty, you cannot unboil it. So there was no scientific evidence to stack up against what they were doing. So women literally were just told, you have to accept being treated as second-class citizens. Your sport is disposable. We don't care that it's unfair. We're going to carry on with WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Agency, because we want to pretend that we want sport to be fair, but we understand women's sport is no longer fair and we don't care. And that was their position. So, it's horrendous. It has taken 10 years to get us to row them back to a place where they're acknowledging that males have a biological advantage over females. I mean, how insane to say that.
And obviously, when we're talking about the IOC and the Olympics, we're talking about the most elite standard of women's sports. But the reality is this isn't just affecting elite women's sports, it's actually affecting grassroots women's sports as well. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so what we've found is that, all our hard work has meant that we've now got to the point where we have almost sort of protected elite women's sport. That's not true in things like the FA, and FIFA, but, they were very, very hard work to get them to protect it. They have now. Some of that is down to insurance and the Supreme Court ruling earlier on in this year. But FIFA are still allowing an awful lot of DSD male athletes to be able to compete. We've got athletics, we've got boxing. I think we've also got downhill skiing. They have brought sex screening in, which is really, really helping. What I would love to see happen is that they bring sex screening in, obviously, for the IOC and for the Olympic Games. But what people don't realize is that women's sport at lower levels has been thrown out as a compromise. So, they'll turn around and go, oh, yeah, well, we'll protect the elite athletes, but we're not going to protect grassroots. We're not going to protect juniors. We're not going to protect recreational. So how do you think we get elite if we ruin all the pathways, And why is it that if you're good enough, you're worth protecting, but if you're not good enough, you're not? I mean, that to me is a ridiculous state of affairs because you're saying, well, it's sex discrimination not to give you fair sport, but it's okay to not to give you unfair sport. So none of that really makes any sense. And again, in sport, what we find all the time is that people, women and girls, just self-exclude. So rather than having to deal with this, whether that's going into the changing rooms or whether it's coming up against the male in sport or just feeling that no one's got your back, women will just go, I can't fight this, so I'm just going to stop doing it. And that's what more and more women do, sadly. So this word inclusion is utter rubbish, because what it's doing is excluding women from their own category of sport. And sport is done with the biological reality of the body we have. It is not played with feelings. So it's down to these sporting organizations to find ways to include everybody. But again, most women that identify as trans, most biological females that identify as trans, of which we had a boxer in Paris last year. So not Khalifa. But this is a female boxer from the Philippines who identified as being male, still opted to compete with the women. Because A, they stand no chance if they compete with the men, but B, it doesn't bother them. And it doesn't bother the other women what you identify as, whether you identify as a man or you identify as non-binary. As long as you're not taking illegal substances, nobody in women's sport could care what you call yourself. They just want it to be fair. So if women can do that, why can't men? So my feeling is that men need to make men's sports and men's spaces safe and inclusive for all non-conforming men, because that's what they still are. They're non-conforming males, whatever they call themselves.
I did want to ask you about last year's Olympics. Obviously, we saw Angela Carini pull out after I think it was less than a minute, saying she's never been punched so hard in her life when she was boxing against Khalifa. Do you think that was a wake-up call for a lot of people on this issue?
Well, it was a ridiculous state of affairs. I mean, it happened because the World Boxing Association, which the IOC did work with in the past, they fell out with. They had some sort of internal political problems with them. And so they literally stopped them from running the boxing at the Olympic Games. And they already had in place, a way of screening. And Khalifa had been stopped from competing in the previous World Championships. So then their whole agenda was, well, Khalifa has a female passport. In the UK, you can apply for a female passport. It costs you 80 quid, whatever it costs you to buy, you can just apply for it. So what a ridiculous state to say anyone that has an F on their passport can go into women's sport, because literally that means anybody. So that was what they decided was their agenda. I mean, DSD is another complicated space, and people often get it mixed up. Trans-identifying males who feel unhappy in their body as a male, who want to identify as being female. A DSD athlete, of which World Athletics have reported there's been 135 since 2000, when the Olympics took out sex screening. 135 just in track and field, all right? So that's men that are identifying into women's sports. The Rio 800 meters had 3 men on the top of the women's 800 podium. The first woman came fourth from Canada. No one's heard of her. So it's a huge problem, the DSD. And this is a DSD that only affects men. It's a male DSD, 5-ARD. It's what Caster Semenya had. Caster Semenya is not a female with unusual levels of testosterone. Caster Semenya is a biological male with male levels of testosterone, who when was born was misdiagnosed because they had a very small genitalia, and somebody went, oh, it must be a little girl, and they wrote an F on their birth certificate. That is it. They had they are totally biologically male, and they had a male puberty and all the male advantages. And that is the DSD, which has been dominating so much in women's sport since 2000. So I hope the IOC, pay attention to that as well, because World Athletics, as I say, have got their sex screening in place anyway, so that will be protected. But FIFA is where all these athletes are now going. So when they're being thrown out of other sports, they're all just going into football, because at the moment, football is not protecting the female footballers.
And you, like so many other people who do speak out on this issue, have been subjected to lots of personal attacks, I'm sure. Was there ever a point where you thought, this isn't worth it, it's not worth the cost to my professional career? And if so, what was it that kept you going?
I think you do get to a point where you kind of go, you're either all in or you're all out. And for me, it was just a personal conscience thing because of what I went through in the 70s and the 80s with my sport, and how let down I felt by the IOC, and how many of my friends would have had a very different life if they'd won the medals they should have won. And so I just thought, I won't be able to sleep with myself. You won't be able to sleep with my conscience, if I just don't do anything. So I learned quite early on that there is no placating the trans activists. Literally, there is nothing you can say or do unless you absolutely capitulate to their wild thinking that anyone can decide who they are. We can just feel our way into anything. A 15-year-old cannot feel their way into the under 12s race, all right? A heavyweight cannot feel their way into the, bantamweight category. in para sports, we can't have someone who's, missing both legs, turning around and feeling their way into a different category. We have to base categories in sport on reality. And I just still to this day can't understand how we're in this position. How do we allow this to happen? That people can feel their way and choose which category of sport they want to go into. World Aquatics, when they decided to protect the female category a few years ago now, after the whole Leah Thomas situation, they put on an invitation event at the first World Championships in World Cup in Berlin for trans athletes, and not a single trans athlete turned up. And that tells you everything that we've always known. This has got nothing to do with inclusion. They are already included. No one has ever been excluded from sport. They've just been asked to compete where it's fair. What they want is the advantage of being in women's sport. And when they're told, no, you can't have it, all hell lets loose. And what we're saying is we want everyone to do sport. I absolutely have always wanted everyone to do more sport. I am mortified by the fact that young girls now are giving up sport at 12 and 13 compared to 14 and 15 a few years ago. That we're retaining less young girls in sport, which helps their health, their physical health, their mental health, but gives them resilience and team building skills and all sorts of wonderful things that sport does. And we're losing our girls from sport. And instead of helping them, we're putting these things in front of them at the moment. So I'm mortified about that. And I want more people to do sport of both sexes. However, I do believe that women are entitled to have a category of sport that is free from males. And I just will never understand how that can be contentious.
And I think currently there are about 34, female sports categories at the grassroots level that do allow male participation. But to combat that, you and Around the World yachtswoman Tracy Edwards have yesterday, I believe, launched the Women's Sports Union, which is an amazing initiative.
Yep. Here we go, look. There's our little logo.
Perfect. Can you tell people a bit about the Women's Sports Union and what kind of work you're doing and how people can support you to finish off?
Yes, so Tracy and I have obviously been in this battle for a little while. Tracy's been behind the scenes for a little bit because at one stage she was employing 20 people with her maiden charity. So once that was finished, she's decided that, she could be a little bit more open about it. But I've been talking about it for sort of 10 years, and we decided that we needed a vehicle where everyone could either come and donate, either anonymously as they want to. They can join, which again is private, become a member, help us to be able to fight this. People are still worried about breaking cover. I mean, I could give you so many horrendous stories which would literally break your heart, about fathers who've got daughters that play football and were self-harming because they were made to play boys, older women that are walking away from their fitness classes because they're being made to change with a male in the corner of the changing rooms. Young girls, right, at 11 coming back from school sports day saying that the headmaster decided to run a co-ed sports day to be inclusive. Well, it was inclusive because everybody was doing it. But not a little girl won a sporting event all day at sports day. So this 11-year-old went home and said, Mum, why am I bothering? What message are we telling those little girls? Absolutely heartbreaking. So I've got so many of those, and I just thought we need a vehicle. We need a vehicle to hold the feet to the fire of these very, very weak organizations that are giving in to trans activists and DEI hires on their boards instead of standing up for their female athletes, which is extremely cowardly. So we're going to remind people of what the law is. We are going to talk to them about insurance, which becomes null and void if they break the law, which means that their public liability insurance doesn't work. And we're going to hold CEOs of these organizations personally responsible if they don't do their jobs and stand up to DEI officers, and do what's right by their female athletes, but also by the law again. The Supreme Court clarified the law in April and made it extremely clear that in law and the Equality Act, woman means biological female. So all the protections that are there for women, whenever you use the word woman or girl, whether that's in sport or in a changing room, that is who it needs to be. And so find better ways. I'm sure there are ways we can create spaces where people can have, certain mixed sex sports or competitions or teams, providing people are prepared to sign away their injury risks, because the moment you set a male in a woman's team, the risk to injuries for women is going to go up. But if our people that want to do that, then they can sign those documentations. But ultimately, women's sport needs to be kept for women.
Sharron Davies, thank you very much.
Welcome.